Reverend R. We welcome Reverend R, and we are curious about what you have to say about life here at Fourth Church. I have noticed that Reverend R is focused on letting us know God loves us, and he urges us as a congregation to love one another. He reinforces his message through biblical stories and situations from his own life. Oh, do we need loving kindness at these times. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Fred, I can move this over here. This is just communion wine up here. That's all that is. So, can you hear me okay? All right. If you can't, and well, you can decide whether you prefer that or not. But I appreciate the invitation to be with you. I've been looking forward to this. I was asked, what am I going to speak about? I didn't know anything, so I said life at Fourth. And I am talking about that, but I'm talking about that from a little bigger perspective about what does it mean to be church these days? And the question I've put is, what does the world need from church these days? And so I want to theologize about that a little bit with you, and perhaps you'll find it worth some conversation. If you probably know this about me, but in the year of our Lord, 1986, I was ordained by saints in Charleston, South Carolina, and that same year, I preached at my mother's ordination service, at which point I became a preacher's kid by both mother and father. The following year, I married the Carol Wells, who was the daughter of a preacher as well. And it is recorded in the session minutes of the Riverside Presbyterian Church in Jacksonville, Florida, where I served for 6 years. It's recorded in the session minutes, so it's Presbyterian history. The word is, our current pastor married up. And there is no question about that. We have 2 kids. Our daughter is an associate pastor at Fifth Avenue Church in New York City, and our son is in physician assistant school. He's doing a rotation in women's health, and 3 days ago participated in birthing a baby. So it's hard to imagine that I have children that can be present for these kinds of things. The last 19 years, I served the Village Presbyterian Church, which was founded in 1949, so it's just 75 years old. I was the 3rd pastor or senior pastor of Village. The founding pastor graduated from Pittsburgh Seminary, went to Prairie Village, Kansas, which was more prairie than village at the time, and he organized this church and stayed his whole ministry. He was the pastor for 47 years. And when he retired, the church had 7,700 members. I came 10 years later, and it had 4,500 members. I am pleased to say when I left, it still had about 4,500 members. So what am I going to talk about tonight? I want to talk a little bit about, ask the question, what does the world need from church? You know, church is not our idea. Church was God's idea. It happened on Pentecost. God evidently thought the world would benefit from church. So how? What does church need from us? If you don't want the whole sermon, here's what I'm going to say. I think it's in these days, we should be a model of friendship. We should practice humility. We need more Pentecost preachers than prophets. We need them both, but we need more Pentecost preachers than prophets. I'll explain. And we need hope. So, I'm thrilled when it works right. Thank you, Fred. Where does Jesus show up? So every church I have served, we had some variation of what we call new member class, or at the last church we called it tell me more about this church. It's for folks kind of around the periphery to learn a little bit about this particular congregation, and perhaps join, perhaps not, but learn. And about 15 years ago, maybe 20, I noticed that there was a shift in the questions that people would ask in these classes. When I first started, people would ask questions like, I grew up Baptist, but I understand you Presbyterians believe in infant baptism. Do you believe in infant baptism? I'd say believe in it. I've seen it. You Presbyterians, you believe in predestination. Now, I don't know what that means, but I don't think that's right. My favorite was, why do you pass it? Do you know what they're talking about? Communion elements. It's an Episcopal background or some background where you come to the front. The point is, all of the questions were doctrinal. For a long time of American Christianity, we distinguished ourselves from one another by how we think about God, how we think about the ministry of Jesus Christ. There was an unintentional consequence of that. It suggests that being a follower of Jesus Christ is primarily an intellectual exercise. It's deeper than that. I had a friend, Dan McKnight. He was pastor of a Presbyterian church in Kansas City, and he had a lot of young people, and he had one guy who was on his session, an active young adult, and one day he called Dan, and he said, Dan, can you tell me what our church believes? And Dan said, well, I'd love to talk to you about that, but Clay, what's prompting this question? I mean, you've been here 5 years. What's prompting this question? He said, well, I got to tell you, Dan, I was talking to my dad last night, and he wanted to know what our church believes. All my friends just want to know what we do. There's a difference. There's a big difference. When I was in college, I got a job being the choir director of the New Prospect Baptist Church in Lawrence, South Carolina. It's not a highly coveted position, but I got it when I was a junior in college, and I love those people. But one of the things that was part of their liturgy is they would tell their conversion story. They would talk about when Jesus came into their hearts. This was not common language for me. I'm Presbyterian. We probably think Jesus enters us head first, and so Jesus coming into the heart was not really common language for me. But the truth is, neither of those is adequate. Head or heart is too individual. The place where Jesus shows up is not in our head or in our hearts. Jesus shows up in our relationships. Our faith is a faith that calls us to love one another, and you can't love unless there's another to love. It's not difficult to be Christian by yourself. It's impossible. It cannot be done by ourselves. There's a moment in Jesus' life when a scribe came to him and said, Rabbi, there's 613 commandments. Which one matters the most? What are we for? And Jesus says, you were created to love God with all that you are and love one another. He did not say, here's a copy of the Apostles' Creed. Go over that. Love God and love one another. I've been inspired as I've been with you. I've spent a lot of time with your long-range planning committee. And one of the things that you have lifted up through listening sessions is that you sense a need for us to be connecting to one another, to be a place where friendship is practiced. I appreciate those of you who said, I came to hear you. I need you to know, I know that's not true. You came to be with each other. And that is the basis of being church. I think this practice of friendship has both a pastoral and a prophetic edge to it. First, the pastoral. It was about 10 years ago, I began seeing some data about the extent of loneliness in the American culture. AARP was doing research, and this was over 10 years ago. They reported that 35% of adults 45 years or older reported being chronically lonely. Dr. John Cacioppo was the director of the Center of Cognitive and Social Neuroscience at the University of Chicago, and maybe somebody in this room worked with him, I don't know. But he did research on loneliness, and he reported that when we are lonely, there are elevated levels of epinephrine, a stress hormone in the body, that our white blood cell counts are altered. He writes, loneliness penetrates every cell. When you are lonely, the whole body is lonely. A year ago, the U.S. Surgeon General identified loneliness as a public health crisis that needs attention like we have given to heart disease, to cancer, to diabetes. He said when we are lonely, the physical health consequences include a 29% increased risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke, and a 50% increased risk of developing dementia. Additionally, lacking social connection, he says, increases risk of premature death by more than 60%. He compared loneliness on a person's health. He equated it with smoking cigarettes on a daily basis. I think that we should remember the first thing the good book says is not good is to be alone. We were created for relationship. We were created for friendship. And the church needs to be a place that models friendship because Jesus shows up in our relationships. And the pastoral side of it is I don't know anybody who doesn't need friends. I have never met anybody who doesn't need friends. You are doing a good job of that tonight, so thank you. There's a prophetic word to this friendship practice as well, and the prophetic word is there's a cultural narrative that we hear all the time that says you're on your own, that you're on your own. For David Brooks speak a couple of times in the last month, and both times he cited that the greatest concern he has is the low level we have in what he calls social trust, that we are suspicious of one another. As early as Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and Mark Dunkelman's The Vanishing Neighbor and David Brooks' The Second Mountain all point to a decline in social trust. The neighbor is viewed with suspicion. Brooks calls it radical individualism. Individualism has become a virtue that is killing us. It's too easily embraced by the binary narratives that are so much a part of civic conversation. It's either or. It's 100% good, 100% bad. It's Democrat, Republican, it's Israeli, it's Palestinian, it's black, it's white, it's rich, it's poor. We used to be a people who thrived on nuance, but no more. Ken Burns spoke at Brandeis commencement recently, and in that he surprised me and my jaw dropped. He said, in what we call the Holy Land, it has given birth to the three monotheistic religions. If you've been there, the temple grounds, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you can be in any of those and hit the other with a rock. You can throw, it's that close. And Burns said, rather than those monotheistic religions being a breath of peace in the world, all three have rejected the teachings of their faith and turned that land into an unending graveyard. And then he said, God does not distinguish among the dead. They are all God's children. We are all God's children. So to say the church needs a place to be a place of friendship, we're saying you are not in this on your own. It is not us and them, because in God's eyes there is no them. We are in this together. So the church needs to be a place where we emphasize and engage our relationships. Not because we all think alike, because we don't. If you think we do, come look at my email. I can tell you, we don't all think alike. So a second thing, you still with me? Can I go some more? A second thing is, Nanette said yes. She can't have, she's on staff. She has to say yes. Yeah, right there. Yes, please. I think it's time for the church to practice humility. In 1884, the Disciples of Christ in Des Moines, Iowa, launched a journal called the Christian Oracle. The workings of that journal in 1891 moved to our fair city, Chicago, and in 1899, the Christian Oracle changed its name. Part of the leadership at that time decided that oracle sounded too like we're speaking on behalf of God. It bothered them, but not because they had a sense of humility. The Christian Oracle changed its name to the Christian Century, a journal that has some ties here to Fourth Presbyterian Church. Where did the name Christian Century come from? Well, it was widely believed that the 20th century would be the century where the church made the world Christian. That our powers of influence would carry the day across the globe, and by the end of the 20th century, the world would largely be practicing Christians. This is obviously not what happened. It is obvious that God does not want a world where there's one faith. You can noodle on why you think that's the truth, but God clearly does not want a world with one faith. First in Europe and later in the U.S., the practice of Christianity has had a precipitous decline. Here at Fourth, if you got my video today, here at Fourth, there was a time when we boasted 5,400 members. I don't know if we ever had that many Presbyterian noses at one time, but that was the list. And we are now just over 3,100 members. Let me put that in context for you if you are lamenting. Don't. In 2022, 66.4% of all Presbyterian congregations in the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, had less than 100 members. The majority of Presbyterian churches have fewer members than we have people in this room right now. Congregations that have 1,600 members or more constitute less than 0.5% of all congregations nationally. You still remain a place of significance and leadership. Don't doubt that. But the truth is, the church as a whole no longer has the cultural sway that we once assumed we did. We just don't. Now, I say it's time for humility in part because that's the honest choice or the honest posture. For the longest time, we assumed that our calling was to make our neighbors Christian. I think maybe our calling is just to be Christian to our neighbors. The only life you can be Christian with is yours. You can't be Christian with anybody else's life. And so that's a more humble posture than much of American Christianity has practiced, but I think it is valid and timely. I'll say more about this. So I was born in 1960. My dad was a pastor, kept getting run out of town over civil rights issues. And so I was aware of that cultural dynamic in the ways that an elementary kid is aware of those things. But part of my takeaway was the church can change the culture, that the church can change the Senate, that the church can change the congressman, congressperson. And that happened, slowly, bit by bit, time after time. The pastor who founded the Village Church in Kansas City before I came here, where I served before I came here, Dr. Bob Manili, he once had a sermon of his that he preached at Village reprinted in full in the New York Times. That doesn't happen anymore. All right, it just doesn't happen anymore. And I think there's an opportunity in embracing this humility, because it reminds us that it's up to the church to be Christian. It's not primarily our job to make others be Christian. It's up to us to live the teachings of Jesus Christ, because we are the ones who have professed that Jesus is Lord. Am I making sense to you? Yes. So humility is a gift. I think humility also invites us to reject binary conversation that is so much part of the culture these days. And I'll tell a story that has troubled me. From 2011 to 2019, a woman named Pam Bondi served as the Attorney General for the state of Florida. In that position, she did things that people in Florida do. And so there were progressives who took issue with her work. It turns out about 5 years ago, she was on her way to a movie theater in Tampa, and some of these liberal protesters surrounded her, and they did not question her work. They did not question her policies. They attacked her. They called her a horrible person. They told her that she was an embarrassment to the human race. They were so proud of this engagement, they filmed it and posted it on Facebook. The irony about this, and they also prohibited her from going to see the movie she was going to see. The irony is the movie she was trying to see is Won't You Be My Neighbor, the documentary of Fred Rogers. We need a humility that distinguishes the importance of being right and being righteous. I've preached to you about this. When there are issues in our culture, we need, as people of faith, to discern what we think is right. That's important work. But once we've done that, then we need to engage in the work of righteousness. Righteousness in Scripture is almost always a relational term. Righteousness is to be in right relationship with God and with neighbor. And so without compromising what we believe to be right, we need to remember that faith calls us to do the hard work of staying in relationship with those you might think are crazy, and allow that they might think you are crazy. I was taught a lot about this by this young woman, Valerie Kaur. Valerie Kaur is of the Sikh religion, and in her stunning book, See No Stranger, she narrates what happened to her religious community, the Sikh community, after 9/11. Sikhs are not Muslim. They had no connection to 9/11. But we're a culture that is largely ignorant of any other part of the world. And so her community was brutalized, sometimes killed. Members of her family were. And she started doing what she calls practicing revolutionary love. And she got very specific about it. She said revolutionary love is a practice of being curious. She said, when I meet someone that I do not know, that I do not understand, that I can't wrap my head around. Her grandfather taught her, that is not a stranger to you. That person is a part of your life that you have yet to discover. And so be curious. That's a practice of humility. It is looking for the good in others rather than just latching on to what's wrong and what's broken. It feels like we live in a culture where people are getting their PhD and calling out everything that's wrong about everybody around them. And it doesn't take a lot of smarts to do that. We're Presbyterian. We know everybody's broken. Everybody's sinful. To find what's not right in your neighbor doesn't take a lot of courage or creativity. But to be curious about the image of God in everyone is a practice of revolutionary love, and it's a practice of humility. So when I say it's time for us to be humble, that's what I'm talking about. Am I making sense? All right, I can keep going or I can stop. Yeah, I mean, you've had wine, and I've preached to sleeping people before, so I can. It's not going to bother me. Valerie says keep going. All right. No, that's not so sure anymore. She was there at the beginning. So, I think we need more Pentecost preachers than prophets, but we need both. So, most of my ministry, I've tried to talk about what's going on in the world and to talk about what I think the Lordship of Jesus Christ means for what's going on in the world. And with the kind of steady drumbeat, I get the response, Tom, stop being so political, right? Stop being so political. So one thing I want to say about that is that puts me in a long line of preachers. My dad was accused of being political during the Civil Rights Movement. My grandfather was accused of being political during the New Deal. Jesus was accused of being political and was crucified for it. So that charge has been around a long time. So I have two things to say. One is, when you want to critique the preacher, let's get more creative than that. All right? That one's been tried. Let's get more creative than that. Preachers need critique, but that one is been overused. Secondly, and opposingly, it's a very important conversation. A couple of things. Politics and Christian faith are in the same conversation, but they don't play the same role. Politics writ large is about how we relate to our neighbors, how we exist in our communities, how we live in community. That's what politics writ large is. Christian faith is a faith about how we relate to our neighbors, how we live in community. Both of these are in the same conversation. That does not mean they play the same role. There's a difference in being political and being partisan. Partisan is too small for the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is an insult to associate the gospel of Jesus Christ with any partisan walk. But the gospel of Jesus Christ addresses the whole of life. A story. You may not know this. In December of 1861, the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America was held in Augusta, Georgia. Dr. Joseph Wilson was the host pastor at First Pres Augusta. He brought his young son in knee pants, Woodrow Wilson, to the meeting. Woodrow showed very little interest in a church meeting. The one recognized as a theological giant at the time in the Presbyterian Church was a South Carolinian named James Henley Thornwell. He stood before the assembly dressed in black swallowtail coat and high-heel boots. He leaned on the pulpit for support because his body was diseased. He would die within a year. But he articulated for the assembly that the church must focus on spiritual matters. He then continued and said, the existence of the institution of slavery is purely a decision of the state. And as people of faith, the existence of slavery is beyond our sphere. Arguably the most significant moral failure of our nation, and the Presbyterian response was, let's not talk about it. I hope that leaves you uncomfortable. That when we say we can't talk about this, what we are saying is the lordship of Jesus Christ is limited. That the lordship of Jesus Christ addresses some aspects of our lives, but not all aspects of our lives. And there is no way in our tradition or scripture that we can find justification for that. Jesus is Lord, which means everything. God cares about everything in our lives. So not talking about it is not a great option. But how we talk about it is equally a practice of faith. I said throughout Christian faith, there have been prophets. God calls people to speak the truth. Prophets sometimes are misunderstood. They're believed to be people who can tell the future, That's not really their gift. Sometimes they actually got the future wrong. But what prophets do have a gift, prophets see the present in a way that's different from the majority narrative of the culture. And because they see a different present, they anticipate a different future than the majority culture. It's not that they are fortune tellers, it's that they see the reality of today and they name it. They name it. That would be our language. They name it. Prophets are very concerned about what is said, how to speak the truth. And the world needs prophets. But on Pentecost, we just read the story a couple of weeks ago. The Spirit descended on the disciples. They went out. There were Parthians, Medes, Elamites there. In other words, there were people from every time and place that were gathered. And the disciples proclaimed the gospel with the tongues of the people who were gathered. The reaction was, what is this in my own language? I used the metaphor Pentecost preacher because the Pentecost preacher is not simply concerned about what is said, but about what can be heard. How can it be heard? How can we engage in conversation about important things and keep each other in the room? Prophets don't always excel at that. They're important. They're not always popular. And so a lot of people run away. And it's important ministry, but it also means that we need to figure out ways to talk and keep each other at the table. A parable. For most of my ministry, I have the issue that has consumed the PCUSA, you have been in the midst of this, is the inclusion of the LGBTQ community. Our best biblical scholarship, our greatest theological work, our most intense pastoral work has been devoted to that issue. And over a generation of that conversation, we learned who's on what side. We knew who was on what. We had our team jerseys. We knew who was on our team and who was on the other team. But several years ago, I went to a General Assembly, and a new issue was put on the floor, and I don't remember the specifics, but it was something about the Middle East. And it was as if the Spirit of God went into the locker room and mixed up all the jerseys. Because all of a sudden, when we stood up on our side to proclaim enlightenment, justice, kindness, and truth, people we heretofore had thought were crazy were on our side. And people who were our friends of a generation were on the other side. It all got mixed up because the issue changed. I think we would be better if rather than the issues determining who our friends are, our friendship informed how we navigate the issues. That, I think, is what is needed in this time. All right, I'm going over time. I'm gonna tell you this. I said we need hope. I want to tell you about my friend Bashar Awad, and then I'll stop and see if you have questions or comments, or if we sing a hymn and go home. Bashara is a Palestinian Christian, and he founded the Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem. It's the only Christian theological school there. And I was visiting Bashara, and the college, you've seen those security walls that run through Israel, and it backs right up to his college. When it backs right up to his college. So if you look out his office window, there's the wall, and there are the gun turrets up on it, and we were standing there talking, and it depressed me. It depressed me, and I said, Bashara, do you find it challenging to maintain hope? And he looked at me and laughed. I mean, this is a man who has been in the Middle East conflict his whole life. His father was killed in 1948. And Bashara said, Tom, God raised Jesus Christ from the dead not more than a 20-minute walk from here. It is impossible to lose hope. I will leave you with that. I think we need holy friendship. We need humility. We need to care enough to talk to each other in a way that we can be heard and listen, and we need hope. Thank you. What do we do now? Do you go home, or are there questions, or? Questions. You're going to tell me.
Yes, so now is the time for questions, right? So if you have a question, just raise your hand. We have these fancy little microphones on every table. So you would just turn that microphone to yourself and push the button once, and the red light will come on, and then you know your microphone works, and your voice will be heard coming out of every table. So what questions do you have for Tom?
I have a question. Thank you so much, Pastor Tom, for coming to speak to us tonight. I'm increasingly becoming very concerned about the strength of the Christian nationalism in our country, and I want to know what you think our church could do to oppose this movement and to educate others that it's not biblical.
I think that was your last presentation, was on Christian nationalism, and I would say I think we will not have a lot of luck in changing them. I think we will have better luck in being more magnetic ourselves, being more faithful ourselves. I share the concern. Part of the challenge is that I'm forgetting the scholar now. It'll come to me after I go home. But there's a fellow who's done some research on this, and one of the things that is happening is there are an increasing number of people who identify as Christian, even evangelical, who don't ever go to church. That their religion, their politics has become their God. And I think if we have a devotion to God without practices, worship, confession of sin, passing the peace, practices of generosity, if we divorce our theology from some of those practices, it's going to lead to bad theology. And so one of the things that I think is the best option is to be so good at what we do that people are curious. So faithful, so loving, so kind, so just that it captures others' curiosity. I have fundamentalists in my family, you do too, and to approach that from a rational standpoint is way more than challenging. I've never succeeded. That's probably not the answer you wanted. Not very encouraging. Anything else? Yes.
Hi, my name is Deborah, and I think it was 19 years ago. You can correct my math, you who know better. But Wayne and I and our son were in Hiroshima. And we had a guide. We were there on vacation. We were about the only Americans. In those days, nobody went to Japan as tourists. And so we had a guide, and she led us through the exhibit in the Peace Museum of the 60th anniversary of the bombing. And I was so upset, I just could not stand it. I was crying through that whole museum because they had asked people who had lived through it to draw pictures of what they remembered. And you can just imagine what that resulted in, the kind of artwork. So it was very upsetting, and it's a wonderful museum. Those of you who've been there, you know that. And she was Shinto, and I said to her, Yumi, how can you be with us? Her family, they were affected. Many died. She herself had been hauled over to China because her father was a diplomat. But, it just stunned me, the power of forgiveness. And I don't really remember her answer. I don't really think it's important. It was that business about attraction, not promotion, through the way that she lived. And she guided us around with such love. And then she took us to her temple, and, it was like we were equal. And I just want to say that I don't think forgiveness is emphasized enough. We hear so much about love and peace and listening and all that stuff, but to me, it's so paramount, the business of forgiveness, and not forgetting, but of letting go of the poison. And I think only then can we move on. Thank you.
That's a great story, Deborah. Thank you. Anybody else want to share something? Morgan? Yes? Push the button if you would.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
now you're good.
Yeah, I appreciated the whole presentation, and I love it because it's all, biblical. It's what God is telling us to do. And I feel the presence of God, and where Jesus shows up is always in relationships, and especially when we're serving our friends or serving in service, whatever you do. That's why God does equip us to be disciples, to do that kind of work, because we were born into community, but we were born not for ourselves, but for others. It's for the community. We have to make a living and go to school and everything, but we do each have a purpose, and we all, as everybody knows here, we all have those gifts that God has given us, the special gifts. But we have to use them, find out what they are, and then use them.
Thank you. Somebody over here? Yeah.
Thank you, Tom, for a wonderful presentation. So I'm thinking about what you stated, okay, so we should be a more magnetic church, have more charisma, and we should be Christians and show that in our relationships. Can you give us some idea of exactly how we do that? What's a program? What's the way forward?
So let me brag on you a little bit. I was, Don and Carol can say I was saying this at the table while we're eating. One of the things that has not caught Carol and I by surprise, that's not the right word, but has been noteworthy, is you could not be more welcoming to us than you have been. It's just not possible. You have been gracious, accepting, appreciative, kind, and that's magic. That's magic, and so I would start by claiming that as a strength and figuring out ways to build on that. And that didn't just happen. That's part of your long story here at the church. But that, it's not a program. It's not a structural decision. It's not calling the right staff. It's a matter of the heart. And I think you're better at it than you know. And so keep leaning into that. That's the only wisdom I have. Anything else? I don't think they're planning to serve breakfast, so. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I would add to what you both were just saying, and that is Monday night supper, sandwiches, showers, lunches. That it really is an outreach. Oh, and then mornings, watching the people come through for goods and services from Chicago Lights. That's the friendship.
That's huge. This is the first time that I've served a church that was urban. It's always been suburban. I've never had a social service center. I had a staff person that people came and knocked on the door. We knew who to send them to, and we'd help with vouchers and stuff. But to know there were going to be 100 people coming in every day, I've never had that. And I feel like I'm walking on holy ground every time I walk through here because of what you do. The people who eat in Anderson Hall, and it's fantastic. It's fantastic. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think communicating that to our members. I have been attending Fourth Press since 1992, and I just hear those as an eye-opener that I had no idea about the service center. And I know about the dinners. I've been participating in choir trips and everything else, but I think the more educating of our membership, however it is, if it's in a sermon or whatever, I think that's very helpful, because then people can say, well, we're doing more than just coming and pledging and so forth. We actually are making a dent at some level.
I love that. And I think not a lot of churches. I think churches of this size always have a risk of launching, as you have launched, significant ministry and then take it for granted. Because it takes so much energy to launch, it involves so many people, you assume everybody knows it. And it's easy to take ourselves for granted and not, and we need to remember there are people new coming in every Sunday, every Sunday. 2 weeks ago, there were 4 families here from Kansas City. I don't know how they found it, but there were 4 families here from Kansas City. So, I failed to ask how long this goes, and so that's the cardinal sin. But Goon is standing, and so I'm taking that as a sign. Thank you for your graciousness even tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
And also, thank you, Reverend R., for guiding us in how we should relate to each other and practicing loving kindness. Cornerstone, so I just want to let you know about our future plans. Cornerstone will meet again in September. This is our last meeting for the season. And it will be under the leadership of Nancy Thompson. And we wish you all a good night, and thank you for coming.